You're listening to Walking Close, Living Changed, a podcast straight from our dad's heart to yours.
You're about to hear from someone who has lived out his faith in front of us our whole lives.
We've seen our dad walk through the best and worst of times, and no matter what, he always demonstrates humility, grit, and a whole lot of humor.
These aren't just words. They're the overflow of a life surrendered. And we're proud to introduce you to the wisdom of our dad's life. This space is for those who are learning to trust God in the middle of it all.
So grab some coffee and get ready to listen.
This is Walking Close, Living Changed with our dad, Pastor Brian.
Hey there. I hope you listened to last week's episode because last week started a series that I don't know when it will end, but just a few episodes in a row where I want to talk about people who successfully received a miracle in the moment. Like they asked Jesus for something, and within that same time frame of the story with Jesus, they received their miracle. As opposed to the stories in the Bible where God certainly came through for people, but it was many years in the interim, or there was a lot that had to transpire before the miracle came to pass, or in opposition even to the fact that some of our prayers actually go unanswered and some of our miracles never come, and that sometimes the trial of our faith is how faithful we will remain even if our miracle doesn't come. So with all that said, sometimes God's answer to our prayers could be no, sometimes it can be yes, but not now. But sometimes the answer is absolutely and immediately. And so there are several stories like that in the New Testament when people asked Jesus to come to their house and perform a miracle, to bail their friend out who had run out of wine. You know all the stories, but I want to read some specifically. And last week we read about Jairus, who was a synagogue ruler, and he came to Jesus to say, "My daughter is sick. Please come to my house and heal her." From that story, we learned several things, and last week I put them in stages, so you can go back and discover what Jairus went through as he received his miracle from Jesus. This week, I want to talk about another story you're probably very familiar with, and I don't know that I can break it into stages like I did for Jairus' story, but if you'll remember, my whole point of doing this series is that there are no real stages or rather there's no real pattern that just fits one mold of how Jesus might come through for you. And my hope is that over the next few episodes, you'll say to yourself, well, the patterns might be there, but I don't know exactly what my pattern is. God revealed my pattern to me, and I will either obey you, or I'll trust you, or I'll walk forward, or I'll do whatever you need me to do, even if it's do nothing. And that will be my pattern in order to see my miracle come to pass. So that might be what you gather from these stories that I want to read to you from the Bible. And I think that's a long enough introduction. So let's read the story about the Centurion. His story actually shows up in two of the Gospels, Matthew chapter 8 and Luke chapter 7. I'm going to read Matthew chapter 8 and I'll refer to Luke chapter 7. Interestingly enough, there's a major difference between the way these two men told the story. And we might talk about that, which might help us see why the story itself is so significant. The story, as you know, is based on a man who wanted Jesus to heal his servant, but he had faith enough to believe that if Jesus just spoke the word, it would happen. because this man, as you'll hear in the story, says, I'm under authority. I know what it's like to be told to do something and just say, yes, sir. I know what it's like to tell others to do things and expect them to say, yes, sir. So, me knowing who you are, I think that if you just say for my servant to be healed, everything involved in his sickness will obey you and get out of my house. And then Jesus, of course, praises the man for his faith. Well, the fact that this man had such a keen feeling for authority, I think, is the key to the miracle that he received. But let's read the passage, talk about the passage, and maybe this will help you. Surely it will help you in one way or another, but maybe it will help you believe for your miracle. So here it is, Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. Jesus said to him, shall I come and heal him? So that's really cool. Jesus gave him the option of coming to his house. The centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. I would like to call this episode Just Say the Word, or as the King James puts it, Speak the Word Only, but I'm probably not going to call the episode that, so there you go. If I preach this as a sermon, maybe that's what I'll call it. He finishes in verse 9, For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one go, and he goes, and that one come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. That's a pretty incredible statement to make. We're talking about Jesus of Nazareth, who everybody is thinking to themselves might be the new King David of the country Israel. And here he has a Roman centurion approach him. He looks around at all the Jewish people with him who are his kindred, who are his people, who are the people who are supposed to be Abraham's children, the father of faith, Abraham. And these people around him are supposed to be the best at demonstrating faith. But he says, I have not found so great faith in all of Israel. And then he adds this, which is a little bit of theology that we probably won't get into, but he says, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus finishes the story, and verse 13 records it. Jesus said to the centurion, Go, let it be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that moment. That's amazing. This, I think, is one of the only times Jesus demonstrates his power to heal from a distance. And I hope you're amazed by it. But I want to look at a few things about the centurion, because this series of episodes is supposed to be about looking at the person who demonstrated the faith and how it moved Jesus. And I'm telling you, this passage actually says Jesus was amazed. Like, if you can demonstrate faith that causes the Son of God to be amazed, that's worth looking into. And so, before we even look at exactly what must have been in the centurion's mind, which of course I already implied during the introduction of this, let me say this about faith in general. We know that there are many types of things in this world. Like you can talk about a thing and somebody else could say, no, that's not the thing I experienced, but it was the same thing I'm talking about. It's just that you felt it a little different than me. I saw it a little different from you. They heard it a little different than I. Depending on how you experience it, you might see it a little differently. And faith is kind of like that. Like it's multifaceted and it can be discussed in many different levels. Obviously, the centurion was walking at a very high level of faith. But the point I want to make about faith is that in some ways, faith might be your responsibility. Here's what I meant when I said you can look at things different ways. I know that the Bible teaches, especially like in Romans chapter 12, it teaches that each of us has a certain measure of faith that was dealt to us by God. Of course, that passage is talking about the faith you might need in order to apply the certain giftings that you've been given, the certain giftings that you're supposed to use in order to help redeem the world with God. So we know from that there are levels of faith that are dealt to you from the hand of God. And so some of you might be able to say, you know what? I wasn't dealt the greatest hand of faith. I'm working with just a little bit here. But of course, we know from Jesus' own testimony that even if you've only been dealt a little bit, the way you work with it is to understand that just a mustard seed worth of it would be enough. And Jesus said that if you had a mustard seed of faith, you'd be able to speak to a mountain, have it dislodge itself from the ground, and go throw itself in the sea because you spoke to it and told it to do so. And that it would only take a little bit of faith for you to have that kind of quantum power, so to speak, over what seems like a solid object right in your path. So even if all faith is dealt to us, and some of us have just a tiny little bit, it's still our responsibility to trust and to apply it with the power that God wants us to apply it with. So anyway, my point, especially from reading this story, is that your faith is probably your responsibility. James said it this way when he wrote about asking God for things. Now, he was specifically talking about asking God for wisdom. And the fact that he was talking about asking God for wisdom might help make my point, because to ask God for wisdom is to ask God for something that you are darn sure is already his will. And the Bible promises throughout, from cover to cover, that if somehow deep in your spirit you have tapped into what God's real will is, then when you ask for it, it's coming to pass. And so maybe that's part of why James uses something in his example that we all ought to know is something God is ready to give us. So he says, when you ask God for wisdom, ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavers is like a wave of the sea driven with the wind and tossed. And after establishing that imagery in our minds, he actually gets so bold as to say that kind of person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. So like, not only will they not receive the wisdom they asked for, but the person that wavers like that, they're not getting anything, according to James, who, he was pretty hard-nosed, but he's writing a letter to the church that we receive as scripture. So you might want to consider listening to his advice. And that is, take faith, take faith as your responsibility. Decide to ask like you really believe it, and then see what God will do. And so back to the story of the centurion, this guy understood responsibility. And he understood responsibility because he understood a word that has become taboo in our modern culture. I'm afraid to even say it, but he understood something called authority. And I know that in our way of seeing things, in this independent world that we live in where everybody wants their own identity, they fight for their identity, they vote for their identity, they do everything according to that identity that they have earned on their own. I know that submission, obedience, and authority are things that irk people right now. And that irksomeness, I guess, has been brought on pretty honestly because a lot of people have taken advantage of their authority. They've manipulated people. They have victimized others. And the word authority has gotten a bad name. But let me tell you this. And just before you turn me off, I hope you won't turn the episode off. I hope you'll just listen to the end and then cuss me later. But right now, if you can hear me say the word authority and not fall apart, I would like to tell you that God believes in authority structures. He believes in authority structures that are so powerful that when someone who is under another authority says something, he is actually speaking for the authority that he came to represent. Now, listen, that's not a matter of like being so submissive and subservient that you're just saying, yes, sir, no, sir, I don't have my own identity. I'll just go be obedient. That's not what that kind of submission says. What that kind of submission says is, I have grown to trust and know the one who's in authority over me. And more than that, he's come to trust and know me so much that he believes I'm worthy to go speak for him. And that might be a good segue for me to tell you about the little difference between the two gospels, the two gospel renditions of this story. Because when Matthew told the story in the version that I read, the centurion actually shows up. Or at least that's what it sounds like. Like the centurion is right there talking to the Lord, saying, can you speak the word only? And in Luke's version, the centurion just sends representatives, and those representatives come under his authority and speak in his name. And it makes me wonder, I mean, like, if the centurion really wasn't there and Luke is telling the story exactly right, then I wonder if anybody ever stopped Matthew and said, Matthew, hey man, don't you remember the centurion wasn't really there? And Matthew stepped back and said, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, because authority is authority, and I can tell the story as if he was there because he's the one who sent the word. Because that's how powerful authority was to them, that if a man sent his word, it was as if the man was standing there himself. And so I don't know if that's the justification you need in order for both the gospels to be different. I don't care about them being different. It's two great testimonies of the most amazing story that even amazed Jesus. But what I do have to say to you and to me is that if we need a miracle from the God who needs to tell our situation how to turn out, we might need to step back and ask ourselves, do I still believe in authority well enough to believe that every spirit that's been hindering me will obey God? Do I believe that the sickness that has just tried to touch my family will obey God? That all of the elements that must come together, whether it's the freakish coincidence that needs to happen to bring the correct brain surgeon to the table, who knows exactly what to do, even though there's not another person on the whole planet who knows what to do, this guy happens to show up in your town at the same time that your loved one needs brain surgery. Don't tell me that the God who is in authority didn't work that out. And I tell that story from experience because I have had friends, more than one, have very similar circumstances where God somehow, through the sands of time, looked and knew this situation and commanded things to fall together so that people could receive their healing. But I told it with the medical inclusions there because I want to sound rational and sane. But let me tell you this, I've also known people who believed that God could command their disease to disappear, and somehow it did. And I don't know, like I said at the beginning of this series, I don't know if your pattern that you're going to follow to get your miracle is just a snap of the fingers and there it is, or whether God's going to line up 18 events that culminate in your miracle. I don't know how he's going to bring things to pass, but I know this. It would really behoove you to believe in authority, the authority of Jesus, to be able to speak a word only and bring your miracle to pass. That kind of faith impressed Jesus. That kind of faith moved his needle. And that kind of faith, I don't know if it caused him to say, okay, your servant is healed. I mean, I don't want to use like cause and effect when it comes to God, because he's going to make his decision and that's going to be that, putting it back on his authority. So I'm not sure that there's a cause and effect between you, your responsibility, and God and his decisions. But I can tell you this, after Jesus saw that faith, he was happy to turn and tell the centurion, your servant is going to be fine. And then for the centurion to get home and find out his servant was healed at the very moment Jesus spoke, that was an incredible miracle based on a simple belief that authority is authority, and that when the person in charge says yes, the answer is yes. And when he says no, the answer is no. And that's not only okay, it's actually God's way. And I don't want to even add much more to this, to look for stages or patterns or anything else. I just kind of wanted this episode to be an encouragement for you to believe that God is the ultimate authority, that God respects the idea of authority, and that if you could get your mind around authority, get your mind around the fact that when it's healthy, it's a good thing, it might align you closer to the one who could speak the word only and bring you your miracle. If I were going to add any more to this, I would say that the centurion definitely knew who to come to and how to say what he said. And I said I would, like if I were going to preach this, I would entitle it, Speak the Word Only, and your servant will be healed. Well, because the centurion knew something about the spoken word. Of course, that's wrapped up in the whole authority thing I was saying, that your word is the law, etc. The way we used to think about men and women of power, that if they spoke, you went and did it because they said so. And I'm not talking about dictators who need to be resisted. I'm talking about moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas and bosses and good people who are coaches. I'm talking about people who have positions, and just because of the position they're in, we respect them and we honor them and we trust their authority. That he knew somehow that Jesus had the authority to speak, and whatever he said was going to come to pass. Now, like I said, I told you if I was preaching this, I would make the point that he knew who to go to, because Jesus not only spoke the word, but he was the word. He was the final authority. You can't read the New Testament without picking that up, that the word of God, even though what we talk about oftentimes when we say the word, what we mean is the leather-bound pages that have made it to us through the generations. But when the Bible itself speaks of the word, it's talking about that entity of God, which is the spoken authority. And it was incarnated in the person of Jesus Christ, that he himself was the Word. Colossians speaks to this, and so does the Gospel of John in the first chapter. If you want to go read a little bit about that and see that Christ himself was the Word. Well, here's what the centurion did. He came to the one who was the Word, and he got a word of authority, a word that said, this is how it's going to be. And here's the point maybe I can leave you with, that if you begin to understand God's authority, trust God's authority, let down your own guard that you've built up against that word, that you've built up a resistance, so to speak, of, like, oh, I can't allow people to have authority over me because I've got to be my own person and I don't want to be told what to do and no one's going to control me. Those are all, again, good things to fight for and great things to, to keep in balance. But understanding God's loving, kind, gracious, powerful authority is a key to being able to receive the kind of miracle this centurion did, and to understand that Jesus, being the Word, speaking a word, was enough to get him his miracle. What that says to you and me is that if we can get a word from the Word, then we also might be able to attach our faith that we're responsible for to that word that Jesus has spoken. I don't want to get too crazy weird on you, but for real, if you're struggling in your marriage, you turn to Jesus, the Word. You look into him. You read through all of the scriptures, especially the red ones that he said that talk about kindness and gentleness and submission and beauty and love and trying to represent him and his church. And you begin to put all this together and you say to him, Lord, if you had this much to say about marriage, I think you could fix mine. And then from that moment forward, something begins to happen because you put authority, or you allowed the authority of that word from him to begin to mold and shape your own view of how you've been acting in your marriage, and it begins to change you and your marriage. That's just one small example, but your life is full of examples waiting for this kind of miracle to be able to happen. And I'm leaving you with that to tell you that there might be some miracles that you need in your life. You need to find out what Jesus might have had to say about it. Go to him who is the Word, receive a word from him, believe that word like the centurion did, and then go on about your business because it's going to be done. I've often accused myself of rambling on and prattling and saying way too many words in order to get my point across, but I don't think I regret it today. Again, since I'm Brian Opbrook, I guess I can apologize if any of this didn't make perfect sense, but I hope, above all, that hearing about the centurion's faith, hearing that his faith in a word from Jesus being able to make the difference, because when he told his servant to go, the servant left. And when he told his servant to come here, his servant showed up quick. And because he understood authority like that, he was able to say, well, Jesus, whatever you say is going to happen. Whatever you say is what I say. And whatever you say is what I believe. And by now, whether I believe it or not, I am convinced that whatever you say is just plain already done. And so that's that. Take hold of your own faith. Take responsibility for it. Go look through things that Jesus said that might have something to do with your need and attach your faith to it and say, well, if he said it, it ought to come to pass. Do that, guys. Do it. Have the kind of faith this centurion had. Operate in that kind of faith. And I'll see you next time when I think of what story we should read next. Amen.
Thanks for listening to Walking Close, Living Changed.
We hope today's episode encouraged you, challenged you, or met you right where you are.
If it did, share it with a friend or let us know what spoke to your heart.
Until next time, keep walking close and trusting that God's not done writing your story.